There was a waiting list after her death. Collectors often paid for the sculptures when they were still only lines of code. People never knew exactly what they were getting. They were paying for the next edition of Leftover Fun. And really, we were not selling to many people who planned to keep it for themselves anyway. Not at first. We focused on collectors who would donate their vessel to a museum. We wanted the pieces to be as ubiquitous as Degas' Little Dancer aged 14. When people thought of art, we wanted them to think of Mother. So Mother's usual stable of collectors knew that they needed to donate one piece if they ever wanted to get off of the waiting list, to have their own in the future. 5 years after Mother died, new Merodes had been acquired by the Whitney, the Jago, the Centre Pompidou, the Tate Modern, and the Broad. Somewhat unexpectedly, however, was the new demand from China and the Middle East, two regions that were seeing many more museums built. And where there are new museums, there are galleries that need defining works from around the globe. So it is good to be recognizable and in multiples, like a Warhol Brillo box. But we found that some new collectors from around the world did not appreciate the way that Western galleries conducted their waiting lists, where collectors of lesser renown may never reach the top of those lists, no matter how rich they may be. A Russian oligarch wanted all of 2025. A Saudi prince wanted every winter for the next decade. A wife's birthday was in December. I didn't think much of it. I was glad that there was still so much interest in Mother's continuing work. Even after 5 years, we still primarily worked with the same collectors who Mother had made relationships with throughout her life. Sometimes we took meetings with businessmen whom Mother had never met. They would sit with us and Patrick, obviously believing that Patrick did most of the talking and made the final decisions. These businessmen did not like it when Margaret and I, we were still teenagers, mind you, when we would rattle them with question upon question about their taste and where they saw the works exhibited if they should ever acquire one. Patrick did not like it either, but Patrick did not ask the questions that I knew Mother would care about. It was easy to detect a rat. One man tried to tell us that he wanted to place a Leftover Fun at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. When we asked him what his favorite works at the museum happened to be, however, he couldn't name one past Da Vinci's Salvator Mundi. He didn't even know that the painting was never actually exhibited there. Worse yet, he assumed that we had never visited the museum ourselves and wouldn't catch his lie. We didn't even need to do research on the collectors when their mistakes were so obvious. One afternoon, however, I was reading the Chinese edition of the art newspaper, and I saw that a businessman from Shenzhen had acquired a Leftover Fun at a Hong Kong auction. He had paid a foolish amount for the piece, $5 million, making it not a record price, but one of the more expensive pieces by a woman, particularly for a piece that was not a painting. At the time, we sold the Leftover Funds on the primary market for $1 million each, after having started with $500,000 in 2017. After reading about the auction, I immediately called Patrick. We could only reach his longtime assistant Kelly, though, and she swore that she had no idea how this could have happened. The sculpture had been put up by an anonymous seller. At the time, Margaret and I did not have careers outside of managing Mother's estate, so it was us who followed up with every museum and collector to investigate how this Leftover Fun ended up in a stranger's hands. We had no luck. Then nearly a year later, another leftover fund was auctioned. It would be a second leftover fund that would most likely never be seen again by the public for years or even decades. This time we did not need to call Patrick, because Kelly called us before we even read the news. Through her own investigating, she had found that Patrick, and one of Mother's most beloved collectors, had orchestrated the auctions behind our backs. Kelly told us that she needed to speak up, and she was finally resigning the position of assistant, which I understand she had held for much longer than we'd been alive at that time. Over the phone, I asked, "Are you a gorilla girl?" There was a long pause on the line. I could feel the warmth of her cheeks from across the country. "In spirit," she said. "In spirit." Yes, this little art world backstabbing had become quite the topic of New York high society gossip, hadn't it? Margaret and I fortunately did not pay attention to that. This was our mother's legacy, not gossip to pass the time at dreadful parties. Even when we avoided those, though, friends still asked us about rumors they'd heard about our final meeting with Patrick. Somebody heard he'd pulled a knife. This is more or less how it happened, though. Margaret and I realized that it was inevitable that Mother's works would be auctioned off, particularly when these men were so eager to trade leftover funds as if they were oil futures. So after discussing everything with Vicente, who was the third representative of Mother's estate, we decided that we could do real good with the money brought in at auction if they continued to command such absurd dollar amounts. The spiderwebs could be much more than our college tuition and trips abroad. So Margaret, Vicente, Patrick, and I had our final meeting at the Bowman Gallery. Patrick was obviously unhappy before we even sat in the chairs. After Margaret and I thoroughly explained our decision to Patrick, he tried to be apologetic. He tried to explain himself, but I saw very little need in paying attention to that. The man in the suit suddenly seemed very small. He sounded much more desperate than I'd ever heard him before. He said, "But you'll need somebody to help you shepherd the leftover funds through the entire Christie's process." Margaret said, "We know, and we will be working with Kelly in those matters." Isn't that wonderful? I thought Patrick would explode. He stood up. He was so frustrated. Though he quickly sat back down, perhaps realizing that he began to appear irrational. And then he looked at Vicente, who Patrick may have believed he could cajole something out of. Patrick pointed at Vicente and said, "You." Vicente returned a rather quizzical look, as if to say, "Did you really just address me as you?" Patrick told him, "I could represent you. Do you want a solo show? I can give you a solo show within the year. I will have things rearranged for you." Vicente smiled at Patrick. I believe he tried to stop himself from laughing. And very nonchalantly, Vicente said, "Describe my work." Patrick practically shrieked, "What? What are you asking?" Vicente was very casual. He said, "Tell me about one of my pieces. Any of them. Maybe one that I've told you about." Patrick pretended to be confused. He asked, "What are you getting at, man?" But Vicente would not break his calm. He said, "You really can't, can you?" I thought Patrick might froth at the mouth. His eyes bolted from one of us to the other, and he said, "This is fucking ridiculous. You do that thing with the paint. Come on. This is fucking stupid. Don't be stupid." "Well," Vicente said, still very calm. He said, "Anna Maria and Margaret have made it clear what they'd like done with the future leftover funds. So I believe this marks the end of your representation of the estate of Celia Merode." Patrick yelled, "You're going to let some fucking teenagers decide what happens to these?" My sister said, "I'm actually 20 now." Patrick couldn't help himself. He said, "Oh, go fuck yourself, Margaret." We were already standing up from our chairs, but now we rushed to the door. Patrick howled, "I didn't mean that!" While we walked through the gallery, we heard something that sounded like a chair being thrown at a wall.